The first-class cabin of Liberty Airlines Flight 7117 from London to New York gleamed under soft lighting with polished walnut paneling, crisp linens, and a hush of exclusivity that hovered over every inch. Champagne glasses clinked gently as flight attendants moved between wide leather seats offering pre-departure refreshments and hot towels with well-practiced smiles. A hedge fund manager in a tailored suit was reviewing market forecasts on his tablet. A famous influencer documented her seat for her millions of followers. Everything exuded status and assurance. Near the rear of first class in seat 3A by the window sat a tall young man wearing a plain navy hoodie, slim-fit jeans, and old white sneakers. His face, youthful yet composed, was familiar to those who paid attention to politics or tabloids, but unassuming enough that most overlooked him. Barron Trump, son of a former president, grandson of a legacy, and a quiet force in his own right, rested his hands on his lap, gazing calmly out the window at the tarmac. As the final passengers boarded, a flight attendant named Heather approached him, her heels clicking with precision. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Would you care for some champagne, sir?" she asked, voice professional but clipped. "Just water, please." Barron answered, his tone polite, his accent faintly East Coast with hints of European polish from years abroad. Heather gave a small nod, but not the warm, lingering courtesy she had extended to the suited man in 2B moments before. As she turned, there was a subtle downturn of her mouth, barely perceptible, but Barron noticed. He'd seen that look 1,000 times before. It was the look of people trying to place him, judge him, categorize him. Not angry, just unsure. As the boarding doors closed and the plane began to taxi, Barron leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. This trip wasn't business or pleasure, it was reconnaissance. For months he'd been evaluating potential investments in underperforming legacy carriers. Liberty Airlines, despite its storied name, had been hemorrhaging customer loyalty and facing lawsuits over discrimination. Barron had quietly acquired a significant stake through a private equity vehicle 2 weeks prior. No press releases, no announcements. He wanted to see the rot from the inside with no filters. The plane lifted into the clouds, and as the city lights of London receded, the cabin settled into its transatlantic rhythm. When dinner service began, Barron watched how the crew interacted with other passengers. The tone, the attention, the indulgence, it varied. The middle-aged white couple across the aisle were fussed over their orders, taken with smiles and small talk. The South Asian man in 4C was barely acknowledged, handed his meal without eye contact. Heather returned to Barron's row. "Beef or chicken?" she asked, not even pretending courtesy this time. "I'll have the beef, please," Barron replied. Moments later, she placed a tray in front of him, a dry bread roll, a plastic cup of lukewarm water, and a single packet of butter. No entree, no silverware. "This is what's available for you," she said, then turned and walked away. There was a pause. The air around him shifted. A few passengers had noticed. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others smirked quietly. Barron didn't flinch. He simply took out his phone and snapped a discreet photo of the tray. Then, opening a secure messaging app, he typed to his assistant, "Incident confirmed. Documenting. Initiate phase 2 on landing." He didn't touch the food. Instead, he sat quietly, his fingers methodically breaking the bread into pieces on the napkin, arranging the crumbs, in a shape only he understood, something that reminded him of chessboards from his childhood. He recalled his mother's words, "Control your emotions, Barron. People remember how you made them feel, not what you wore." She had raised him in a world of luxury, yes, but also of restraint, of observing before acting. The man in 2B, already on his second whiskey, was regaling a bored flight attendant with tales of his 6-figure crypto gains. Barron watched silently. Heather passed by again, eyes flickering briefly over the untouched tray. She said nothing. He noticed the crew increasingly avoiding his row, as if discomforted by their own actions. Across the aisle, a middle-aged black woman named Denise leaned slightly toward him. "Excuse me," she said gently. "I saw what happened. That wasn't right." Barron turned to her, his expression softening. "Thank you, but it's okay." "No, it's not," she said, voice low but firm. "You didn't do anything wrong." He gave her a faint smile. "Sometimes it's better to let people reveal themselves fully." The flight wore on. Lights dimmed. The cabin fell into a quiet lull. Barron stared out the window, the Atlantic Ocean, a vast darkness below. In his mind, he was already thinking about the meeting that would take place when the plane landed. About the boardroom at Liberty Airlines HQ. about the executive team that didn't yet know who had become their majority shareholder. He thought of the reports Maya had compiled, 3 years of complaints quietly settled or ignored. He thought of the gate agents who had turned away a war veteran in uniform because his service dog didn't meet the size restrictions of the teenage girl with autism who was left crying unattended in economy when her mother was taken away for additional screening. And now the dry bread and lukewarm water. The smallest insult, but a potent symbol. Barron never believed in grand speeches or viral moments. He believed in structure and systems, in removing rot at the root. And this flight, this deliberate humiliation, was exactly the kind of data he needed. As the captain announced their descent into New York, Barron folded the napkin with the breadcrumbs carefully and slid it into his backpack. He retrieved a plain envelope marked Post-Landing Briefing. Confidential, filled with executive files, staff evaluations, and a signed letter of authority. Heather returned one last time, her smile a little tighter now. "We hope you had a pleasant flight." Barron looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said. "The service was memorable." She blinked, unsure whether it was sarcasm or sincerity, then moved on. When the plane touched down and rolled to the gate, the usual rustling began, passengers grabbing carry-ons, checking phones, fixing their hair. Barron remained seated, calm. He glanced once more at the folded napkin, then slid it into his coat pocket. A Liberty Airlines agent entered the cabin, scanning the first-class section. He approached Barron with urgency and respect. "Mr. Trump, the conference suite is ready. The CEO and board are waiting." At that moment, Heather's eyes widened. Several crew members stiffened. Whispers started. Passengers turned. One muttered, "Trump, wait. That's Barron Trump." Barron stood slowly. Taller than most in the cabin, his quiet presence now commanded the air. He turned to Denise across the aisle. "Would you be willing to join me? I'd like you to witness what happens next." She blinked in surprise, then nodded, gathering her bag. As they walked up the aisle together, the entire cabin fell silent. The man who had been served bread and water was now the man holding the future of Liberty Airlines in his hands. And no one in that crew would ever forget the moment Barron Trump stepped off the plane, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with a plan. One that would change everything. The glass walls of Liberty Airlines' executive conference suite shimmered with the light of early morning spilling through the airport terminal. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation and unease. The long mahogany table, usually a place for dry strategy discussions and optimistic quarterly reports, now felt like a courtroom. The top brass of the company had been summoned with no agenda, only a cryptic message from the chairman's office: immediate attendance required. Subject: passenger experience review. They didn't yet know that the passenger in question had just disembarked from their own aircraft, nor that he now owned a controlling interest in their company. Barron Trump stepped into the room, dressed not in a tailored suit, but in the same simple outfit he wore on the flight. His hoodie was now tucked under a sleek navy overcoat, and his presence, calm but unwavering, immediately shifted the room's energy. Behind him walked Denise, the woman from across the aisle, her expression unsure but composed. Beside them was Maya, Barron's chief of staff, carrying a secured briefcase and a thick folder of documents marked Confidential Liberty Operations. The CEO of Liberty Airlines, Leonard Preston, stood first. A seasoned executive in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and the air of someone used to being the most important person in the room, he extended his hand with a wary smile. "Mr. Trump," he said, "I must say this is unexpected." Barron didn't immediately take the offered hand. Instead, he walked to the head of the table, pulled out the chair, and gestured for Denise to sit beside him. Only then did he sit down. He placed the folded napkin containing the breadcrumbs on the table in front of him like an exhibit in a trial. "You're all wondering why you're here," Barron began, his voice calm, every syllable deliberate. "So let me make this very simple." He nodded to Maya, who opened the folder and began distributing copies around the table. "This," he continued, "is a summary of complaints submitted to Liberty Airlines over the last 3 years. Sorted by passenger race, gender, disability status, and nationality. Over 800 incidents. Only 14 resulted in formal apologies. None resulted in meaningful disciplinary action. The room was quiet except for the sound of papers flipping. Several executives paled as they recognized cases they had personally dismissed. Page 5. Maya said details settlement payouts to avoid litigation. Page 6 includes quotes from internal staff emails mocking passengers behind closed doors. A few people shifted in their seats. Leonard cleared his throat. Baron Mr. Trump, surely you understand that all large airlines deal with a high volume of complaints. Some are unfounded. Baron raised a hand. The interruption was firm but not rude. You're not here to justify this. You're here to understand the consequences of ignoring it. He unfolded the napkins slowly, revealing the dry bread and crumbs. This was my first-class meal last night. No entree, no cutlery, no explanation. Just this. And a flight attendant who looked me in the eye and said, "This is what's available for you." Murmurs began, faces blanched. Now I'm not here because of a meal. I've skipped 1,000. I'm here because that moment, small and cruel, was part of a pattern, and I wanted to see it for myself. Baron opened a second folder and laid out a series of printed screenshots from Liberty's own training materials slides on service excellence that made no mention of unconscious bias, no protocol for handling discrimination, no procedures for internal reporting. You train your staff to be polite. You don't train them to be equitable. You teach smiles, not respect. One executive, a senior VP of Human Resources named Carla, leaned forward. I've been pushing for reform for years, Mr. Trump. We've drafted initiatives, but the budget. It's not about budget. Baron cut in, his tone still level. It's about culture. Then he turned to Denise. Would you mind telling them what you saw? Denise hesitated, then cleared her throat. I saw your crew serve Mr. Trump bread and water while everyone else was getting steak and wine. I saw them smile at some passengers and ignore others. And I've seen it before on other flights, just not to someone famous. Baron nodded. Thank you. He looked back at the table. Now that we've covered the problem, let's talk about the solution. Maya stood and began handing out a second packet, a printed overhaul plan titled Liberty Reset, a New Era in Passenger Equity. This company has two choices, Baron said. Either we lead the industry in reform, or we become the cautionary tale they all cite at conferences. The plan was comprehensive. It included mandatory diversity and empathy training for all frontline staff with quarterly refresher modules. A new passenger respect office, PRO, reporting directly to the chairman's office. Anonymous channels for crew and passengers to report mistreatment. A new public scorecard, updated monthly tracking performance on inclusion and responsiveness. Immediate suspension and review of any employee with multiple substantiated complaints. Additionally, Baron said, his tone hardening just slightly, employees involved in my flight service are being reviewed right now. If the data confirms a pattern, they will be offered severance with NDAs or dismissed outright. Leonard raised an eyebrow. You're doing this based on one incident? No, Baron replied. I'm doing this based on hundreds. Last night just made it personal. He paused, letting the silence settle. This is not a PR stunt. There will be no press release today, no interviews, no social media spin. This is internal until it's not. You will fix what's broken, not because cameras are watching, but because this is who we will be. And if anyone here doesn't believe in that direction, now is the time to speak. No one did. A few minutes later, Maya handed each person a simple form, a recommitment statement. Signing this confirms your participation in the implementation of Liberty Reset. It also confirms your agreement to undergo internal review for prior failures to act. A quiet executive in finance finally broke the silence. What if someone doesn't sign? Then they'll have to find another airline to work for, Baron said without blinking. The meeting stretched on. Questions were asked, pushback was offered, but by the end, nearly everyone signed. The ones who didn't were escorted to HR later that afternoon. Heather, the flight attendant who had served Baron, was one of them. Denise remained beside Baron throughout, not saying much more, just bearing witness. At the close of the meeting, she stood to leave, but Baron gently stopped her. I'd like you to join the Passenger Respect Office, he said. Part-time, if you're willing, as an advisor representing the traveler's perspective. She blinked. I'm not a lawyer or executive. That's exactly why I want you, Baron said. This department isn't about paperwork. It's about people. As Denise left, several board members approached her to thank her for her honesty. It was the beginning of something new. That night, in a private room at the Liberty HQ building, Baron sat alone. On the table in front of him were two things: the napkin now preserved inside a transparent folder, and a piece of paper he'd written during the flight, a single sentence in his own handwriting. Humiliation doesn't break power, it reveals it. He looked out the window, watching a Liberty jet taxi across the runway, wondering who sat inside, wondering whether the crew smiled for the right reasons this time. Phase 2 was complete, and the real transformation had just begun. The sun was rising over the eastern seaboard, casting golden light over Liberty Airlines' new flagship terminal at JFK International. A long line of press badges and flashing cameras marked the start of what many were calling a quiet revolution. But inside the newly renovated executive lounge, now renamed the Unity Room, things were calmer, intentional, reflective. Barron Trump stood near the wide floor-to-ceiling windows, watching as Liberty Flight 001 prepared for its inaugural journey to Manila. This was no ordinary flight. It was the culmination of 9 months of change policy, culture shifts, and hard decisions. On the tail of the aircraft was a new symbol, a silver and navy emblem of interwoven circles representing connection, dignity, and progress. Behind him, a low hum of conversation filled the room. Executives from other major airlines mingled with advocacy groups, cultural consultants, and members of Liberty's new Passenger Respect Office. At one end of the room, a small group of crew members, some who had once been skeptical, stood in crisp new uniforms reviewing service scripts that now included cultural sensitivity phrases and neurodivergence etiquette. The changes had been sweeping. And still Barron knew this was only the beginning. He turned when he felt a familiar presence. Denise, now dressed in a Liberty blazer with the PRO logo on her lapel, approached with a slight smile. "They're boarding soon," she said. "The passengers look different." Barron smiled faintly. "They are different. Not in who they are, but in how they'll be seen." She handed him a printed itinerary. "Full manifest as requested. Our first cohort of scholarship passengers is seated in business class, row 5 and 6. Barron flipped through the pages. The names leapt out: young men and women from underrepresented communities, some first-time flyers, others aspiring pilots, engineers, or aviation professionals. The Liberty Horizons program his brainchild had launched 6 weeks ago. It guaranteed free air travel, internships, and mentoring for students interested in transportation careers, but excluded from traditional pathways. "They're nervous," Denise said almost fondly. A few of them were whispering, wondering if they're allowed to recline their seats. Good, Barron replied. "Because when they realize they are, they'll remember that feeling. And they'll never let anyone else feel otherwise when it's their turn." A Liberty staff member entered quietly. "Mr. Trump, the pilot, would like to greet you before takeoff." Barron nodded, then turned back to Denise. "Walk with me." They exited the lounge and entered the jet bridge, where uniformed flight staff stood at attention. At the front was Captain Alejandro Cruz, a veteran pilot who had flown more than 4 million miles for Liberty, but had once been passed over for promotions twice due to his accent and presentation style. That had changed recently. Captain Barron greeted him. "How's the aircraft? Prepped and pristine, Sir," Captain Cruz said. "And I wanted to thank you personally, not just for the promotion, but for showing that leadership doesn't have to look or sound one way." Barron gave him a firm handshake. "I didn't give you anything. I just cleared the static." They entered the cockpit briefly. New signage adorned the space checklists that included inclusive language prompts for crew interactions and an emergency protocol that now included a section titled Nonverbal Passenger Identification. In the galley, Barron noticed something else new. A whiteboard updated every flight where crew members wrote one word as the value of the day. Today's word: respect. Walking through first class, Barron stopped at row 3, the same seat he had occupied during his humiliating flight nearly a year ago. He ran his hand along the armrest, a flash of memory tugging at his mind. The dry bread, the stifled laughter, the subtle cruelty. He turned to Denise. "You ever think about what would have happened if I'd made a scene? If I'd stood up, yelled, demanded an apology?" She nodded. "Honestly, you probably would have been labeled entitled. And nothing would have changed." Barron looked out the window. "That's the thing. Power doesn't shout. It listens, then it builds." As they continued through the cabin, they stopped at business class. The students looked up wide-eyed, some shy, some grinning. One of them, a lanky teenager in glasses, reached out a hand timidly. "You're Barron Trump, right?" he asked. "My mom said you used to live in the White House." Barron laughed genuinely. "That's true. But that was a long time ago. Now I build things, systems, companies, and hopefully futures." Is it true? Another asked that you were served only bread and water in this seat. Baron nodded. It is. And that moment helped start all this. So, sometimes being underestimated isn't a curse. It's an invitation. He moved toward the rear where economy class was already half full. The energy here was different too, more engaged. The crew smiled, not the forced kind, but the grounded, attentive kind. A family traveling with a child on the autism spectrum had been met with a special comfort pack that included noise-canceling headphones and a visual card menu. An elderly man had a QR bracelet linked to his medication and medical needs. A deaf woman was seated near a newly trained attendant fluent in ASL. The policies Baron had pushed were no longer just policies, they were practice. Back in the jet bridge, Denise turned to him. Do you ever think about what comes after this for you? Baron shrugged. I didn't do this for legacy. I did it because someone had to. But if it becomes an example others copy, then I'll take that as success. They returned to the lounge where Maya was now overseeing a live broadcast of the departure. Richard McCarthy, the company's longtime COO, once resistant to change, now one of its biggest champions, was fielding questions from the press. Baron watched silently as the aircraft pushed back from the gate. He didn't wave. He didn't make a speech. He simply stood with his hands in his coat pockets, his gaze steady. 3 months later, Liberty Airlines hosted its first ever Global Inclusion Summit at their new training center in Dallas. Airlines from 19 countries sent representatives to observe what had happened at Liberty. The conference rooms buzzed with data reports, training simulations, and roundtable discussions. In one panel, a speaker quoted, "Baron power isn't about control. It's about correcting what others have accepted." After the summit, an executive from a rival airline approached Baron in private. You could have dragged Liberty through the mud, sued them, shamed them. Why didn't you? Baron considered the question. Because systems don't change from outside pressure. They change when someone inside rewrites the script. The executive hesitated. Would you consider advising us? Baron didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed the man a card. It read, "Humiliation may reveal the rot, but dignity writes the blueprint." Baron Trump, Chairman, Liberty Group. Later that week, Baron received an email from one of the scholarship students, a young woman named Amina. She had just completed her first commercial flight as a trainee. Her message was short. Mr. Trump, I served a man who reminded me of you. Simple clothes, quiet. The crew almost overlooked him, but I didn't. I looked him in the eye, offered him a warm meal, and asked him if he needed anything else. He smiled, said, "This feels like home. I just wanted you to know. You changed things." Baron reread the message twice. Then he closed his laptop and looked out over the city skyline, watching as a Liberty jet streaked across the sky. He didn't need applause or headlines. The change was happening seat by seat, story by story, and it had all started with dry breadwater and silence. But now the skies carried something new, dignity.